As you know, the leadership coaches were set up with two purposes, one of which is phenomenal executive coaching, and Lisa is one of our executive coaches, and the other is to do good with the work that we do around in terms of supporting charities. So if you're interested and want to know more on that, you can ask me that at any point, and feel free to get in touch later. But for now, I'm going to hand straight over to Lisa, who is with us today to talk about decision making under pressure.
Thank you, Zoe, and it's lovely to be here with you today. So, as you all know, as leaders, decisions are rarely made under perfect conditions. You might have lots of stakeholders who have different expectations and requirements of you. You'll be spinning lots of plates. If you make a mistake, there's lots of scrutiny on you, and often it can feel like the smallest decision can have a really high impact. Under pressure, there are some very specific things that happen in our brains and our bodies that have an impact on the decisions that we make as leaders, and also on the quality of our leadership. What I'm going to do in this webinar is to give you some strategies that aim to improve both. I'm Lisa Quinn. I'm a Master Certified Executive Coach and a former Communications Director. After 22 years in the corporate world, I left communications to retrain as a coach and a mindfulness teacher, and I've been coaching full-time since 2018. I coach senior leaders in the US and in Europe, and like all of the coaches who work for Zoe, we understand what it's like to work and lead in fast-paced, high-pressure environments where you've got lots of different stakeholders, competing demands, and the landscape that you're navigating is really complex. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today, and I'm really looking forward to the next hour that we have together. This is what we're going to be covering today. Firstly, we're going to be looking at what happens to us under pressure. I'll explain what goes on in our brains and our bodies and how these really human responses can work against us. I'm also going to share 3 strategies that can help us regulate ourselves. So the first one of those is physical awareness. The second is values. And the third is self-compassion. And these are all things that hundreds of my clients have found useful. Plus, they're all tried and tested evidence-based approaches. What I would say is, I always say whenever I'm coaching anyone, you know yourself better than anyone else. So choose the approach, choose the things that resonate the most with you. Feel free to ignore anything that doesn't work for you. And I haven't walked in your shoes or had your experiences. So you trust yourselves, you know yourselves way better than I do. So everything I offer you is an invitation. Operating under pressure isn't easy. As Publilius Syrus, he was a Syrian slave and he was brought to Rome and known for his succinct quotes. As he says, anyone can hold the helm when the sea is calm, but it's much harder when we're operating in a world where the only thing that's certain is change. What I'm aiming for today is to share some tools and techniques to create a sense of internal calm, so that even when you feel like you're in the eye of a storm, you can have that sense of calm internally. But before we move on to the things I want to share, I want to ask you a question so that we can bring this back to you. And it's this question: when pressure rises for you, what is the first thing that happens? So what do you notice? Do you doubt yourself, or do you want to control everything, or do you catastrophize, or feel unable to make a decision, or something else entirely? There are no right or wrong answers here. Some of us do all of those things. So just make a note of whatever comes to mind. And I'm just going to give you a minute to think about this. So you're just thinking about this question that is on the screen now and noticing anything that comes up for you. And I'm just going to go silent for a few moments just to let you do some thinking. Pressure can sharpen our thinking, but it can also narrow it down. And this is really useful when we're making simple decisions. It's an evolutionary response, and it goes back to when we're on the savannah facing predators. At that time, it didn't really matter very much. You were either deciding to run away from a predator or punch it in the face or play dead. It didn't require much nuance. But today, we're often operating in complexity. Our brains are wired to detect threats. So when our brain scans, and our brains are constantly scanning, when they predict a situation that could hurt our social standing, so it either threatens our status or our identity, and many things to do with work, our brains read as our threats to either of those things. It activates many of the same stress systems as those involved in physical danger. In other words, your brain responds in exactly the same way as it would have done if you were on the savannah and you'd seen a predator. So our amygdala detects threat, and our sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight, flight, freeze system, activates. And then also our cortisol and adrenaline increase, those stress hormones. And this can bring about everything, physical changes. So everything from sweaty palms, your palms might feel hot or sweaty. You can really feel like your heart is racing, your mouth might feel dry, or you might feel nauseous. And when this is going on, our perspective narrows, so we're less able to think expansively. This is a really normal response. There isn't anything wrong with you if you respond in this way. In fact, it's a sign that you're a human. So I don't, I'm not inviting any judgment here, the opposite, in fact, but it is an outdated response and it's not always helpful to us. So again, I want to bring this back to you. I want you to think about a recent high pressure decision that you made at work, and only explore this question if it feels okay to do so. If there's something that's still really difficult for you, maybe avoid that one and pick something that you feel comfortable unpacking. And I want you to explore it with curiosity and compassion rather than self-judgment. So when you think about this decision, what do you notice? What happens in your body? So do you notice any tightness or tension? Are you noticing any of that now as you think back to that decision? And what happened to your breathing? We often hold our breath in a stressful situation. And the other place I want you to think about is, did your tone of voice change or the pace at which you spoke? So I'm going to give you 60 seconds just to write down your answer. And you're just thinking about what you notice, what physical sensations you noticed. And I noticed as I said that my heart rate increased slightly. So yeah, I'm just going to pause here. Now, for some people, we can find it hard to notice our own physical responses, and that's completely okay. Just notice whatever it is you notice. I guess the thing I want you to be clear about is this, that every experience we have involves the body in some way. So even if those shifts are subtle or they're outside our conscious awareness, our brains are constantly regulating the body. They're constantly adjusting our heart rate, regulating our breathing, and managing our energy use, because they want to keep us alive. And as the neuroscientist Lisa Feldman-Barrett explains, she says that your brain's most important job is not thinking, it's about regulating your body, which means that every leadership moment we have is embodied. And therefore, if our first reaction to pressure is physiological and often automatic, it's so fast, we're not aware of it, the real question becomes, can we interrupt it? And this is where Viktor Frankl's insight becomes really powerful. He was an Auschwitz survivor, and his very famous quote, which I came across when I was doing my mindfulness training, was, he says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And what this means in simple terms is that between something happening to us and our reaction, there's a space. And that space allows us to choose how we want to respond. Now, this takes practice, but it's very learnable. And I want to share with you a tool that can help you do this. It's called the ABC, and it can act as an anchor when the pressure is rising. So ABC stands for awareness, breath, and choice. And we're going to bring this to life again through thinking about something at work. So again, think about something at work that is mildly stressful for you at the moment, something which you're finding irritating or annoying. And we're going to go to the A, which is, as best you can, ask yourself, we're going to go back to our bodies and see what physical sensations am I aware of? So what am I sensing in my body? Is it tight or tense? I often tense my shoulders and my jaw, and I can sometimes wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with my fists clenched. So do you feel heat or coolness? And you're trying to do this in the manner of a friendly scientist, you know, with no judgment of yourself. And then ask yourself, what thoughts am I aware of? So is it, I can't do this, or I need to get this right, or this person's annoying me? Whatever it is, you're just noticing it with kindly curiosity. So that's the first step, bringing awareness to your physical sensations and to your thoughts. And I'm just going to pause here to let you note anything you need to note. So just to remind you, you're noticing anything you feel in your body, any physical sensations that you are aware of, and any thoughts that you're aware of, and that's the A. And you're noticing both of those things with no judgment. You're noticing them like a friendly scientist. We could stop there, actually. We could stop with just awareness, because if you do nothing else, it's still going to be better than nothing, because by bringing awareness to your thoughts and your physical sensations, you're no longer in them. They're not running you without you being aware of them. And that's really helpful to our brain and can really improve our decision making. But if you want to move to the next step is B, which stands for breath. And this sounds so simple, but breathing is the quickest way to engage our parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and restore system. When our brains think that we're under threat, so if you've got a tricky non-executive director asking you a question about a line in your budget, for example, or you've got to start the next round of redundancies in the business, we will often breathe faster or more shallowly when we're even thinking about doing those things, or we might hold our breath, which reinforces the threat message to your brain. There's something called email apnea, where if we even get an email that our brains read as a threat, we can hold our breath. And that can cause us to go into fight, flight, freeze mode. When you control your breath, when you slow and lengthen your exhale, your nervous system receives signals associated with safety. And I said earlier, it sounds so simple, but it's also so powerful, because it's the only part of our autonomic, if I can say that word, nervous system that we can consciously control. And actually that makes it a strategic lever, because when you lengthen your exhale, you stimulate, you increase parasympathetic activity, which is really helpful to your body and really helpful to your brain, because this can slow our heart rate, can lower our blood pressure, it can reduce stress hormones over time and improve emotional regulation. So however works for you, if you have a yoga practice, for example, or you have a breathing practice that works for you, that's absolutely great. Carry on doing it. Anything where your exhale is a bit longer than your inhale is going to be helpful. The simplest way, one that a lot of my clients have said that they like because it's simple, is this one. I want to invite you to, again, if this feels comfortable for you, to place your feet on the floor and just put them on the floor and notice whatever's underneath them. And then also notice the chair supporting you. And you're going to breathe in through your nose and then breathe out. Just slightly longer than the inhale. Nothing dramatic, just a little bit longer exhale. So inhale naturally and exhale slowly. And you might want to imagine that you're sending your breath down to the bottom of your body, so you can really feel your feet on the floor. You're really connecting with your feet on the floor, because that's really helpful for our bodies to have our attention in our bodies, even if for a moment. Or you might want to move your awareness to the back of your body and just notice your back against your chair, wherever you can feel, perhaps your hips being supported by the chair, whatever you're resting on, and just noticing the support there. And imagining as best you can that you're sending breath either to your feet or to the back of your body, whichever works for you. And you're just going to inhale again slowly. And exhale again slowly. And we're going to let our exhales head on our shoulders. And if this doesn't work for you, don't do it. You trust yourself, but just 60 to 90 seconds of that can really help things shift. So that's the B. We've had A as awareness, B as breath. And then C stands for choice, because we have a choice about how we want to respond. So if you think back, I'm going to take you back to the stressful situation, having calmed you down nicely. I'm going to take you back to the slightly tricky situation that's irritating you, but hopefully even those few breaths would have helped you think about it from a different perspective. And I just want you to ask yourself this, if it feels like helpful to do so. What outcome do I want? How do I need to be in order to get that outcome? So awareness, breath, choice. This tool takes practice, but our brains are plastic and we can train ourselves to do this. It's the kind of thing that you can practice when you're having a cup of tea or coffee. It's a quick exercise to do. And if you practiced it in a low stakes situation, it becomes much easier to access in a high stakes situation. So why does this matter so much? Because we can't access strategic thinking from a survival state. When we're in a fight, flight, or freeze mode, our brains shift into survival mode, and actually the prefrontal cortex becomes less efficient, which is the bit of our brain which is really helpful to us. It's kind of the executive function. And that's the bit of our brain that's responsible for impulse control and strategic reasoning. It's the kind of the real thinking that we need as leaders. It becomes less efficient. So our thinking narrows, we rely more on habit, we're much more likely to act on our biases, we respond more quickly, we become more certain, but we're not necessarily more accurate. And when we calm our stress response, the opposite thing happens. Our prefrontal function improves. We're much more likely to tolerate ambiguity better. We can take on more data and integrate it more. And we pause before responding. So actually, when our nervous system settles, cognition widens. That's why it's not a soft skill. It's being able to regulate ourselves in this way is a performance skill. I want to tell you about my client, Caroline. She works for an investment firm, and every Monday morning she has to do a stand-up presentation to the whole company. Caroline obviously isn't her real name. When we started working together, she absolutely hated these meetings to the point of where she would feel physically sick. And the dread would kind of start on a Sunday afternoon. We practiced the ABC, she learned it, practiced it several times a day, and over a series of months, she moved from hating those meetings to tolerating them. She didn't love them, but they became part of her week, something that she just did rather than something that she dreaded from Sunday lunchtime that was leaking into her weekend. So that's the first tool, physical awareness, that I want to share with you that can help really improve our decision making under pressure. The second place I want to go is values. Our values are the things that make us tick, and it can be a real game changer for us as a leader, understanding our values. It can help you make decisions that are both effective and fulfilling. And when we are at our best, we embody our values. And they can really help anchor us when we're coming from a place about what decision to make, when we're trying to make decisions. They can help us, guide our choice. And if you think back to the previous exercise, once we've created space through awareness and breath, the question becomes what guides the choice, the C, and this is where values matter. When, as a leader, you make decisions that are in line with your values, something important happens internally. So we have less of that cognitive dissonance, that kind of really horrible feeling when, I know I've had this, when I've made a decision that I know is wrong, I wasn't in line with my values, but I've done it. And it's that really awful, horrible feeling, or when leaders say to me, I knew it was wrong, I ignored the red flags and I've done it anyway. There's less of that. When our actions align with what you stand for, there's less of that internal conflict. And I'm doing this because it's such a physical feeling for me. There's also less rumination, and we second guess ourselves. So there's less kind of, when I had that meeting and I said that thing to that person. which is really helpful for us from a cognitive energy point of view. Secondly, our trust increases, our trust in ourselves. So when you repeatedly act in alignment with your values, your identity stabilizes, because you're not just, a bit kind of moving around. You're not just reacting to circumstances, you're responding from a place of principle, and that strengthens your decisiveness over time. And then third, emotional stability improves. So even when a decision is difficult, if it's rooted in your values, it feels grounded, and the nervous system interprets less internal threat. So there's so many benefits to you as an individual. If you then zoom out to the organization that you lead, when leaders make values-based decisions, the trust increases, because not everyone's going to agree with you, the decisions that you make, if you make them that are in line with their values, but they're going to understand them. And you're going to feel better about them. So that integrity reduces friction. Plus, values can act as a guardrail for organisations when you're under pressure, because ultimately, if your team can see these are the values that we behave by, these are the things that we tolerate or that we don't tolerate, it provides constraint, and that's really helpful. When also under pressure, when timelines are kind of tighter and the stakes rise, it can be really tempting to make short-term decisions. But actually, values, if you make a decision based on your values, those constraints, that way of thinking reduces the reputational risk. And finally, they create cultural coherence. So they signal to people, this is how we do things here, this is how we operate, which stabilizes teams. When we're operating in complexity, the data can shift from kind of moment to moment, circumstances can change, stakeholder demands can fluctuate, but values are stable, and stability improves judgment. Now, you may already know some of your values. My top 3, for example, are honesty, kindness, and growth. But I want to invite you to do an exercise where you think about your own values. We're going to close our eyes. So I want to invite you to close your eyes or lower your gaze, whatever's comfortable for you. And I want you to think about a time at work when you felt you were really performing at your best. So you felt energized, but at the same time, you felt really grounded. So where you were really enjoying your work. Now, it might be in this role or in a previous role. Again, try not to judge yourself. And I want you to bring attention to your body and how you were feeling in that moment. If you could think about how you were at that time, what words come to mind to kind of summarize that? So were you confident? Were you creative? Were you clear or calm or direct or honest? Whatever it was, and you might have a couple of words. You can choose your own phrasing, whatever feels right to you. It may be that you've named some of your own values. And this can be really helpful, because if you think about connecting to one of those values in a difficult moment, really thinking about how that value feels to you, if you're able to, how it shows up in your body. Can really help improve our decision making under pressure. There's a lot of misinformation about self-compassion. I often think it gets a kind of unhelpful rap, really, because self-compassion isn't self-pity. Ultimately, it's about improving. Self-compassion is a tool about improving yourself. It's not about letting yourself off the hook. It's not lowering your standards. It's about how you relate to yourself when something is difficult. So when something goes wrong, when you feel challenged or exposed, that internal voice that we all have, some of us have whole football teams, they can become harsher than any external stakeholder. And that harshness activates the same threat response that we've just been talking about. The benefits of self-compassion, next slide, please, Zoe. If you have any doubts about self-compassion, I would invite you to go and have a look at the website selfcompassion.org, which is run by a neuroscientist called Dr. Kristin Neff. And she has a ton of really valid research showing there are so many benefits for self-compassion that it's not real nice to have. Ultimately, when for leadership, you're under massive pressure, and when performance, reputation, and responsibility are really high, many of us default to self-criticism as a motivator. So research suggests that self-compassion is actually much more effective and much more sustainable. It helps us make better decision making under pressure. If you think about self-criticism, we activate our own threat system, whereas self-compassion activates a more regulated physiological state. So this allows clearer thinking, reduced emotional reactivity, less defensive behavior. And leaders are much more able to pause, assess, and respond rather than react. Secondly, it can really support greater resilience. And this makes, actually, if you think about it, this makes complete sense, because self-compassionate leaders recover much more quickly from setbacks. They take responsibility, but without those kind of shame spirals. And they're able to maintain perspective during failure. So instead of "I am a failure," the narrative becomes, "Oh, that didn't go well, so what can I learn?" And if you think about it, it also leads to increased accountability, not less. And this is kind of slightly paradoxical, because when leaders aren't overwhelmed by shame, they can admit mistakes. And that's not necessarily something that you would know, but if you think about it, it makes complete sense, because you're able to think more expansively if you're kind of less internally giving yourself such a hard time. So you can admit mistakes, you can seek feedback, you're more likely to repair relationships and change behavior. Ultimately, shame blocks growth, whereas compassion enables it. And then finally, last but definitely not least, self-compassion can reduce burnout. So chronic self-pressure, and I see this all the time in a lot of clients, chronic self-pressure is a major driver of exhaustion in high performers, whereas self-compassion can lower cortisol, it supports emotional regulation, it protects against empathy fatigue, and it can make performance sustainable. And it can also lead to healthier organizational cultures, because a self-compassionate leader is much more likely to be able to offer constructive feedback to the team without harshness. And because they're more comfortable with their own failure, they encourage psychological safety, create space for honest dialogue, and have more capacity for compassion towards others. So what does this sound like in practice? So if you're talking to yourself, your inner voice might, if you're being more self-compassionate, it might sound something like, "Well, this is hard, and it makes complete sense that I feel stretched." Obviously in your own words, but "I made a mistake. What's the next wise step?" And then, "Others struggle with this too, and I'm not alone." Ultimately, the question, if you think about nothing else from today, if you remember nothing else for today, a really good question to ask yourself is, what would I say to a trusted colleague in this situation? Because it's not about lowering the bar, it's about removing that unnecessary friction so the bar can be reached more sustainably. Next slide, please, Zoe. And this is a case study of a fabulous client I worked with a couple of years ago called James, again, not his real name. He was a senior executive stepping onto his first board role. And I see this a lot in leaders stepping into, it's a challenging time taking on your first board role. He was highly capable. He had a really strong track record, but he worked in an organization where the culture was, positive feedback was really low, but critical feedback was welcomed. And his CEO wasn't a fan of regular catch-ups. And so he didn't have any idea about how he was doing. And he was finding board meetings really, really difficult. He was replaying everything internally. It was affecting his sleep. He found himself over-prepping for meetings and being defensive when his suggestions or decisions were questioned. He tipped into a threat response, which is really normal and very common, but not actually that helpful. So we introduced some self-compassion post his meetings. And afterwards, instead of, kind of replaying failures in his head, he asked himself instead, what did I do well? What did I learn? and what will I refine? He wasn't lowering his standards. He was speaking to himself in a different tone. And the tone of voice that we speak to ourselves in, it really matters, because we can dial up our stress response if we're not careful. And the results were his sleep improved, his delivery slowed, his confidence at the board increased. His ability hadn't changed, but his ability to regulate himself internally had. Self-compassion reduced his threat. Again, it can go back to, just pausing and taking a measured breath and just saying to yourself, that was really challenging and I'm still learning. Or again, that question, if a colleague I really respected had done what I just did, how would I evaluate them? Ultimately, self-compassion is about applying the same fairness that we apply to others. It's applying it inward. A final slide. As a recap today, I've shared 3 techniques to help improve your cognitive ability and gain more flexibility under pressure. We've talked about physical awareness, connecting to your values, and self-compassion, and I've shared a number of ways to do this. It's been a real pleasure connecting with you today, and I hope you have found this session useful. And as we bring this session to a close, I want to leave you with a question to walk away with, which is, when pressure rises, what one practice from today? Thank you very much. Back to you, Zoe.
And you gave some brilliant examples of where you've kind of like sort of seen this in action. And I guess I was thinking for myself, what are the most typical, most of the time as you are working with board level, what are the most typical challenges that you find when it comes to the actual decision making? Because the decision making under pressure is, once the pressure's gone, what are the sort of the key decisions that you're hearing people talking about at board level?
There are things like, have I got the right team? That's always a big one. Have I got the right team? What am I worried about competitors? If there's an investment, if investors are involved, that's always like trying to second guess what your investors might want. If you're thinking about next round of funding, that can be a big one. External economic factors. I mean, it's endless, really. I could go on and on and on, especially at the moment. I mean, I think it's just so, it's ever changing on a daily basis. I mean, especially at the moment with the news headlines, it's very, very challenging, I think. So yeah, that's a sample.
I think it's as you were just saying that, I was thinking actually exactly what you said about burnout sort of feels like it plays into this a lot, because I think the tips that you gave, like the ABC technique, is brilliant for being able to be more resilient. And again, something that comes up a lot at board level is that, how do I hold myself in this situation, or ambiguity? I think the tools that you shared lend themselves to so many situations as well as decision making. Think about influence or negotiation, difficult situations, they kind of all your tools really mapped over with that.
Thank you. I mean, I think it sounds so simple, but it's actually really hard to do. It takes practice, but I do know that, certainly from my own experience and from clients, that they're all skills. We can learn how to do them, and they do make a huge difference. They see, especially the ABC. One of my clients described it. She said, "Oh, it seems to slow time." Just because you're giving your brain just a little bit more room to think, and you're making your decisions from a more grounded and solid place, rather than from a fight, flight, freeze place. And I think we can tell the difference. I can tell when I've made a decision. I can tell when I'm coaching someone from a really good, solid, grounded place. And when I'm, possibly a bit overexcited, or I'm trying too hard, and then I can kind of feel that, I feel myself, it feels different. And I think the more that you practice it, and the more that you practice connecting with your body, I mean, even that that tool of putting your feet on the floor and just connecting with the floor, because you're sending your brain a message that you're safe. You know, if your brain attention is in the bottom of your body, you're literally, okay, I'm solid here, I'm okay. It's not as, yeah, you're grounding yourself really, and I think it can be really helpful. I think sometimes I wish it was something else, because I wish it was something a bit more sophisticated, but actually, you know, it's science, like we can control. I think it's that bit about, we have this strategic lever, and our breath is a strategic lever, and it can be a real game changer for people. So yeah, that's why mindfulness is, you know, I think it's an understanding how our brains and our bodies work can be really helpful.
It's funny you should say that, because I'm thinking back. So 2 days ago, I was on client side, one of the clients that you work with, and we were doing end of program presentations, and your name came up, and the person that you've coached stood up and said, actually, you know, the ABC technique has been really transformative for me. So it just shows that you use it in your day-to-day practice.
I do, yes.
Yeah, so
I know
important.
I know who you're talking about. He's lovely, and yeah, I think it's made it. I use it all the time, because it's one of those that, you know, I learned it as a mindfulness teacher, and so it's not mine, but it's widely used and widely recognized, and all of the evidence is there. You know, it's science-based. It can make a real difference to people.
Thank you so much. I'm just thinking there's no other Q&A at the. Oh, there is a Q&A. I missed one. My apologies. I didn't read it well enough. It was a comment. Thank you so much, Lisa. Using the ABC technique in the future and understanding my own awareness is what I will practice the most. So some useful feedback there.
Delighted. I'm very happy to hear that. Thank you very much.
I was going to ask you the question that, so I think that this technique lends itself really well to whenever we have anxiety or nerves around a situation. And I'm going to go slightly off piste a little bit, but decision making under pressure. I know that a lot of the people that we work with, they're often on stage, you know, they're doing cross global town halls and things like this.
Yeah.
But when you're on the stage and you think, I don't have time for the ABC, do you have any short, sort of quick tips and ideas around that?
Yes. So I would say, and I heard something the other day, I can't remember who it was, and he was talking about harness your butterflies in the right direction. Just, you know, make your butterflies all swim in the right, fly in the same direction. So in other words, don't try and change your physical sensations, but almost tune into them and make them work for you. So, and to recognize that those feelings are completely normal. If I always think it's a good sign, you know, I felt a bit nervous before doing this webinar, and it's because I wanted to do a good job. I don't think there's anything wrong with feeling nervous. I think it's a really good sign. I think it's a sign that you care, actually. And if nothing else, I always think the way that you stand. So when I worked in the corporate world, I used to wear a lot of heels. And now I think about, actually, it was really helpful for me, because I would have to be careful about how I walked onto a stage and how I presented to people, so how I didn't fall over. But it was really helpful to me to kind of think about, okay, how am I standing, and how are my feet kind of anchored against the floor? And I think that tip alone can be really helpful. And there's lots, you know, again, there's science around that, because you're anchoring yourself to the bottom. If you're sitting down, just kind of noticing how you're sitting. If you're on a panel or something, just thinking about how you're, you know, we can change the messages that we send to our brains and our bodies by how we're sitting. So if we're like, I know with me, if I'm coaching and I get too leany forward, I'm probably overexcited. Whereas if I bring myself back and I kind of settle a bit more, I send different messages to my body. And I think if you're on a panel and you're sitting and you're really conscious of how your body is in the chair and how your arms are kind of connecting with the chair, those physical points can be helpful. Or if you're standing, and you're, you know, you might have something in front of you, just holding it but not gripping onto it. So noticing again, because our brains are sensing all the time. So if you're holding onto something really tightly, or you're holding a microphone really tightly, your brain's going to be reading that in a certain way. Whereas if you're like, okay, I'm just going to ease just a little bit, but not making it wrong, not saying, oh, for goodness sake, why are you gripping the microphone really tightly? It's like, well, of course you're gripping the microphone tightly. You're a human being and you're about to go and present in lots of people, and your brain reads that as a threat. So noticing how you talk to yourself is also really helpful.
Superb. Thank you so much. The other thing I was thinking about that comes up quite a bit is when you're making a decision is the impact that it's going to have on people. I mean, you talked about things like restructures, and again, we sort of hear that, or stakeholders, how the shareholders going to be with this.
Yeah.
I guess I'm questioning whether there's anything you can do to help make those decisions in a way. It aligns a little bit with what you said about values, but I'm just curious if you've got any tips around sort of moving that forward, because if you're making a difficult decision that's going to, I mean, I spoke to somebody last week who's like, actually I've just had to make 70 people redundant, and the impact and the pressure on him having made that decision. So I guess it's linking it with decision making under pressure. He'd gone through the process of making the decision, a bit like what we've been talking about, but was still living with the discomfort of responsibility. That's a bit unfair to say, but I think that's how he would have phrased it.
I'm sure. I guess I'd invite you to get curious about your values and in that situation, and to think about, okay, which one, I don't know him, but it sounds like empathy is a big one potentially. And often if we're, I see this in clients who are really high on empathy, they're so good at imagining what it might be like to be in that person's shoes, that they can take that on. And actually, we don't know what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. Making someone redundant is a horrible thing to do, and I think anyone who doesn't find it horrible probably shouldn't be doing it, to be honest. But your empathy can go into overdrive where you're over-indexing on it. And I think just understanding, like, okay, what is it? Asking yourself some really gentle, open questions about what is it about this situation that's so hard for me? What is going on for me? And just delving underneath it a little bit could be really helpful. But yeah, I mean, that's a really tough situation to be in. And I think, I've worked in businesses before where every year you've had rounds and rounds of redundancies, and so everyone's kind of living in a state of is it going to be me next? So there's a lot of that kind of tensing and fight, flight, freeze going on.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and certainly that resonates with how he was sharing the story. I had another final question that came to me then, but I've forgotten what it was. Let me just have a look if we have any other comments or questions in there as well. Yes, we do. So what do you do when you're coaching someone who you feel has reached a state of burnout and ABC is no longer working?
Great question. I mean, I think ultimately I would say, I'm an MCC with the International Coaching Federation, and they always say that it's about referring on. So if you don't feel you're qualified for something, there's been a number of times when I've said to clients, look, I'm not a medical professional, but my sense is that actually you're not very well, and this is beyond something that coaching can help with. So I would always say refer on. Just take your coaching hat off and say, I'm concerned about you. I'm worried, and my suggestion would be that you go and start with your GP, because there is a lot you can do with someone. But someone, I'm thinking about, I've got two particular people at the moment, both friends of mine who are they're both experiencing burnout, and it's a really serious medical condition, and it needs proper support and intervention, and it's not something that we can deal with lightly. So I would say, refer on. Never be worried about doing that if you feel like, hang on a minute, trust your instincts ultimately.
Yeah, sound advice there. And it's funny, as you were talking, I was thinking some of the feedback that we get is that actually, if we hadn't brought you in when we did, we would have probably been dealing with a case of burnout or people being off on long-term sick leave. So, prevention is better than cure, I guess, here is that nip it in the bud early is my view on this sort of thing. Is when people say, we probably should have dealt with it sooner, I'm like, yeah, absolutely. So learn from this for next time, that we don't end up going around that same circle again. Because
I think you can see it systemically in businesses as well. You can, if you've been coaching for a while, you can kind of see like, this is popping up and this is popping up. I had a chemistry session with someone yesterday, and she's like, I've burnt out before and I don't want to do it again. And that's, I want to change things. So, there are lots of tried and tested evidence-based things that you can do to prevent burnout. But if you genuinely feel that someone is burnt out, then absolutely ABC is not going to touch the sides, basically.
No, I completely agree with you. I think that's really useful. And honestly, we could talk all day and all night about these topics, and so much rich conversation. So just from me to you, Lisa, thank you so much. I think
You're
that was a
welcome.
really rich learning session, and I'm sure everyone would agree. Some great comments, and yes, you'll get further information coming out tomorrow. We've got an aid memoir coming out tomorrow as well, and just as I say, it was really full of rich things. So some of the things that I just jotted down as a brief reminder. So there's that pause between stimulus and response. How we can create that pause is by sort of digging into that ABC technique that Lisa talked about. What's going on in the awareness, how can we use our breath to recontrol, and what choices do we have available, and really sort of taking that time, like Lisa talked about, in order to become more mindful, grounded, what's going on in your body, your lower half of your body in particular. I'm not taking your thunder. You did all this work yourself. I'm just recapping everything that you've covered for us. There are no more comments on or questions coming in, so I think it's just time to sort of summarize and sort of look at what's coming up next. So as you know, this is a part of a free series of webinars that we are running for you all through this year. So we're on month 3. Next month we have got Sue, and she will be talking about delegation and strategic focus. If you haven't booked on yet, you can do so in the same way as you booked on for today, or simply respond to Valentina, who will email out to you all tomorrow. If there's anything that you'd like to follow up on from today's sessionar, I've created a new word, webinar, then feel free to get in touch, info@theleadershipcoaches.co.uk, and we will respond to you. And if there's anything else that you'd like to follow up on, if you're considering coaching or you need some leadership development, then come along to us and we will be happy to talk to you. So from us to you, thank you so much. We will end the event here. If you want to put any further questions in, feel free.